Good evening and welcome on our first of a new series of public lectures called Breaking Ground, Groundbreaking. We chose this title because archaeology is not just about breaking ground. It's not just about digging in the earth. It's also about groundbreaking data analysis, groundbreaking looking into material culture, groundbreaking anthropological work, looking at ancient cultures. So, therefore, we chose this particular title. And the persons who start off this new series, which will be a hybrid series, partly in person, partly online, and also available as video later on, are two of my favorite people. Darartu Mulugeta is a political science and psychology student at UCLA. She's specializing in methods and computing with the primary goal of studying African communities and history. She's currently part of the African Diaspora Archaeology Lab, which is the lab here at the Coatsen Institute of Archaeology, run by Professor Justin Dunnavant. She is a Bunch Research Fellow, and outside of school, she volunteers at the Oromo Legacy Leadership and Advocacy Association as an Oromo language teaching assistant. And Oromo is one of the many languages of Ethiopia. Dr. Justin Dunnavant is an assistant professor in the Department of Anthropology at UCLA and core faculty member at the Interdepartmental Program of Archaeology here at the Coatsen Institute of Archaeology. His current research in the US Virgin Islands investigates the relationship between ecology and enslavement in the former Danish West Indies. In addition to his archaeological research, Justin is co-founder of the Society of Black Archaeologists and an AAUS scientific scuba diver. In 2021, he was named a National Geographic Emerging Explorer and inducted into the Explorers Club as one of the 50 people changing the world that you need to know about. And this is all in captions. He's also a member of the Board of Trustees of the National Marine Sanctuary Foundation, and his research has been featured on Netflix's Explained, on Hulu's Your Attention Please, and in print in American Archaeology and Science magazine. And if you have a subscription to National Geographic, he is currently in your mailbox. If you don't have a subscription, then go to the store and get one, because there's this beautiful article with gorgeous photographs of the work that Justin Dunnavant is doing with many of his colleagues. So, without further ado, please help me welcoming Justin Dunnavant and Darartu Mulugeta.
Thank you, Dr. Vendrick, and thank you everybody at the Coatsen Institute. Again, because we are doing hybrid and we are in interesting times, we're going to be toggling back and forth to the microphone to give our presentation. Myself and Mulugeta will be discussing the topic of our presentation, which is archaeology in the Black popular press, African history in Ebony Magazine. And this research really began in 2010 at the time when I was a graduate student in my first year of archaeology at the University of Florida. And then, similar to today, as I was going through the sort of historiography and history of archaeology, there was very little representation of African and African diasporic archaeologists and their contribution to the field. That led me to a series of research questions, which ultimately concluded in a presentation called A Negro Digs Up His Past, which was named after an article written by Arturo Schomburg more than a century ago. You can actually check out that presentation on YouTube. In conducting that research, I came across information and the history of John Wesley Gilbert, who's often heralded as the first African-American archaeologist, and born in 1865 to sharecropping parents in Georgia. He completed grade school and moved on to study at the Atlanta Baptist Seminary, which is now the theological department at Morehouse College, before ultimately transferring to the newly opened Payne College in Georgia. He became the first student to graduate from that institution, received a partial scholarship to attend Brown University, where he received his master's degree in classics in 1891, and his thesis was on the Demes of Attica. He was then awarded the Athens Scholarship for his excellence in Greek and became the first African American to enroll at the American College in Athens, Greece. It was there he excavated and surveyed the site of Eretria, not to be confused with the African country, but a site in Greece, helping to produce some of the first maps of that site. He returned to the States, where he became the first African American professor at Paynes College, dean of theology, and eventually president of Miles College in Alabama. During the latter part of his life, he traveled throughout the Congo as a Methodist missionary before passing away, unfortunately, in 1923. I encourage you all to explore more. John Lee just published a biography on John Wesley Gilbert. To learn more about his life and the contributions of the field, you all can check that out. And I'll pass it off to my colleague, Darartu Mulugeta.
Thank you, everyone. My name is Darartu. So to carry on with the introduction, African American contributions to archaeology extend beyond the conferral of formal degrees. The birth of North American archaeology, which is often credited to Thomas Jefferson, which was outlined in his notes on the state of Virginia, really began with the enslaved laborers on his Monticello plantation, who were forced to excavate indigenous burial mounds in 1784. Similarly, African Americans such as George McJunkin, the early cowboy who located the first evidence of a Clovis point, and later members of the Works Progress Administration programs, made early contributions to the field. The WPA employed Black men and women all over the South, and dozens of Black women served as the primary excavators for the sites in Swift Creek, Irene, and Macon, Georgia. Irene Mound, for example, became one of the most prominent sites for Georgia's early history and was excavated by a crew of more than 110 WPA workers between 1937 and 1940. 87 of those excavators were African American women. In 1996, researchers got a hold of photographs of these women at work and were able to locate and interview some of the relatives of those involved in the excavations. Snippets of the interviews can be found online and provide further insight into the past experiences of Blacks in archaeology. Other African Americans were employed by the WPA throughout the South to work on excavations and in museums and archaeology labs. Similarly, Meredith Poole has done intensive archival work to identify the early Black archaeologists who helped on early excavations at Colonial Williamsburg.
Thank you. But uncovering more beyond brief mention of these early archaeologists in academic texts has proven challenging. Even the sort of Bible of African American anthropology, the book known as African American Pioneers in Anthropology, provides biographies of many of the earliest African American anthropologists, but no mention of archaeologists. Thus began the quest for uncovering the early history of African Americans in archaeology. And since academic texts revealed little about the presence and contributions of these archaeologists, I then turned to the Black popular press. Ebony Magazine provided a rich history not only to explore Black archaeology, but to understand the public's perception of archaeology amongst the African American community, thus leading to this project and the topic of this discussion.
This project began as an extension of our work with the Bunch Fellows program. I am, as you heard, a political science and psychology student here at UCLA, but I was given the opportunity to join Dr. Dunnavant's African Diaspora Archaeology Lab as part of my fellowship with the Bunch Center because of my interest in African history and influence.
And in our lab, we are doing the good work of turning political scientists into archaeologists. And one way to do that is to encourage individuals to see themselves in the work that they're doing. So before I actually began doing more intensive research on this project, I actually teased the project on Facebook last year. So I posted a number of screenshots from images on Ebony Magazine's online archive. And judging by the responses, over 230 likes, 18 shares and 14 comments, I figured that there would be a wider audience interested in this work beyond my archaeologically inclined colleagues. Furthermore, I saw this as a unique opportunity to reframe Ebony Magazine and the Black popular press generally as a tool of knowledge dissemination and science communication rather than just a popular magazine. Revisiting the Black press as an intellectual and genealogical archive allows us to contextualize the Black experience in archaeology and the role of Black-controlled periodicals and the ways in which they played in knowledge dissemination. Additionally, I believe we can learn a few lessons as to how to increase our relevancy in our archaeological research to attract and maintain wider audiences.
Ebony Magazine was founded by media mogul John H. Johnson in 1945 as part of the Johnson Publishing Company. As a monthly periodical, the magazine was created to highlight Black fashion, beauty, and politics with a clear audience for African Americans in the United States. The magazine was divided into several sections, including politics, entertainment, sports, occupations, religion, education, race, personalities, and departments. The format was modeled after the popular Life magazine, which you can see next on the screen. As one of the most popular Black-owned periodicals of its time, the magazine had a circulation of 600,000 copies by the summer of 1960. In the late 1960s and 70s, Ebony Magazine faced increasing competition from other magazines such as Essence Magazine and Black Enterprise, but continued to grow in readership. The audience continued to grow into the 1970s. Ebony Magazine claimed 1.27 million copies in circulation by 1974. Many people remember thumbing through copies of Ebony, Jet, and Black Enterprise in their homes, barbershops, libraries, bookstores, and local cafes. For the purpose of this research, we turned to a survey of Ebony Magazine as a means to explore how archaeologists were able to convey their research to the African American public through the press. We observed the frequency and content of the articles, the authors and figures spotlighted, and watched for trends over time. What would have taken months of combing through physical copies of the magazine has been expedited by the digitization of the magazine. In 2008, Google began the process of digitizing 50 years of the Ebony Magazine catalog from 1958 to 2008 and made it searchable through optical character recognition. Diving back into the archives for a more thorough survey, we conducted an intense search for references to archaeology and prominent Black archaeologists. Our preliminary survey turned up more than 15 substantive articles spanning from 1959 to 1978. Other references, which included the word archaeology but not an in-depth engagement with the field, were ignored for the purpose of our study.
The results from the survey turned up powerful articles, interesting trends over time, and caused us to further explore key figures and interesting narratives. In general, many of the articles in Ebony Magazine were explicitly attempting to challenge this view of Africa as a quote-unquote dark continent without a substantive history. These articles highlighted early African civilizations, the latest discoveries in paleontological research. Furthermore, Ebony Magazine was sure to name those Africans who were often labeled field assistants in other reports. For example, in articles about the latest fossil discoveries in Kenya, they photographed and named Bernard Nganeno and Kamoyo Kamiu, as well as Richard Leakey, and credited them all with becoming instrumental in discoveries at Kubifora and Turkana. More work needs to be done to substantiate and to fully explore their role in the early developments of African archaeology. Various academic articles and books have been written about the influence of Ebony Magazine and its role in creating a Black aesthetic. The pages of Ebony influenced and reflected the latest in African Americans' fashions, politics, and cultures. One study even noted that the magazine's changes in content seemed to correlate with changes in American society, and found that between 1967 and 1974, there was roughly a 14% decline in articles around Black culture, history, and art, and an increase in Black entertainment, health, and contemporary issues. The trends coincide with executive editor Lerone Bennett Jr.'s own claim that the early 1950s and 60s were a sort of golden age for Black history in the pages of the magazine.
Break for me came in roughly the end of the 50s, after the Supreme Court decision, beginning of the 60s. Oh, what a great period in my time and in the time of our times. Mr. Johnson, in fact, had the idea. He said that, that there's a feeling out there that people want to read more African American history, and you just say, who can do more pieces? Well, I had been studying history, and I go back to that since I was this little boy in Mississippi. So I said I can, and I wrote the first part of what became Before the Mayflower, and we put it in the magazine every month, and it ran for a year or so, and then we put it in the book, and it became one of the best-selling Black history books of all times. But that was the beginning of our Black history thing. And
why do you think there was that response? Why do you think it was successful from the very beginning? It grew and grew and grew, as you pointed out.
I think two things. One is, at this great turning, and I don't know how you feel what people want and who are not expressing. Black people themselves wanted to hear more about themselves. They wanted a new sense of themselves. And that just simply came out in Montgomery. That it was already there. It came out in Montgomery. I think the feeling was there. And I think the articles we did helped that, in the sense that I've tried in those articles, and I've tried ever since, to make history dramatic, human, and readable. I tried to dramatize it. And to a certain extent, I guess, we were lucky and fortunate to do it, but that was our aim. Most people have the idea, even to this moment, oh, history, oh my goodness, I don't want to go to this history class. They're talking about dates, and they're talking about dead people, and they're wrong. It's so exciting, the most exciting thing I can think about. And I tried to dramatize it, and to make it part of a story, and to make people understand it's not something that happened in the 19th century. It's going on right now in the hood.
So let's go a little deeper into some of the key figures and articles in the magazine. First, sticking to the influence of Lerone Bennett, it's hard to imagine that the historical and archaeological interests presented in Ebony Magazine would have been possible without the work of Lerone Bennett. Bennett served as associate editor in 1954 and then executive editor in 1958. But he was much more than a magazine editor. He was a classmate of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. at Morehouse College and was a champion for the exploration and decimation of Black history. Some may know Lerone Bennett for his publications including Before the Mayflower, A History of Black America, and Forced into Glory, Abraham Lincoln's White Dream. His texts regularly challenged mainstream beliefs about Black history. Under his direction, we see a series of historically inclined articles.
In February of 1961, Mark Crawford wrote a short article on William Leo Hansberry entitled "The Scholar Nobody Knows." Mark Crawford worked prior as a reporter for Jet Magazine and later became an award-winning writer for Life Magazine. The article sought to not only bring to light William Leo Hansberry's research and his contribution to the field of archaeology, but also to African history. Born in 1894 in Gloucester, Mississippi, William Leo Hansberry developed an early interest in ancient history. While a student at Atlanta University, he credits Du Bois's book, The Negro, with setting him on the path to undertake the serious study of African deep history. Hansberry would become one of the first African-American students at Harvard University, obtaining his bachelor's and master's degree in anthropology from that institution. After graduating, he taught courses at Howard University's history department, including Negro Peoples in Cultures and Civilizations of Prehistoric and Protohistoric Times, Ancient Civilizations of Ethiopia, and the civilizations of West Africa in medieval and early modern times. All of these courses were taught in the 1920s at a moment when scholars were arguing whether or not Africa had a history worthy of scholarly investigation. He literally had to type, cut, and paste his own teaching materials from newspapers, reports, and periodicals because early materials on African history and archaeology were limited. And in the top left corner here, you'll actually see one of his teaching materials that he used to distribute throughout his class. In life, Hansberry stressed the need for rigorous, transdisciplinary research to undertake the study of African people and focused much of his work on ancient Nile Valley civilizations, as well as modern-day the Horn of Africa. He completed postgraduate studies at the University of Chicago, Oxford University, and the University of Cairo, and was awarded a Fulbright scholarship to study in what is now today's Sudan and Egypt. Hansberry was unable to acquire a PhD, however, as his own advisor at Harvard, Dr. Houghton, argued that there was no university equipped to supervise his research. However, he was awarded an honorary doctorate from the University of Nigeria, and the Center for African Studies there was named in his honor. He was further awarded the Haile Selassie Award for African Research by the Emperor of Ethiopia himself. Hansberry was committed to expanding our understanding of African past and building pride and confidence in Black people. Hansberry not only led the way in establishing a tradition of Africana nubiology, but he also provided the intellectual foundations for Africanist research and scholarship. He argued the centrality of Nubia and influences from further south along the Nile Valley before it was able to distinguish itself as a separate field from Egyptology. Furthermore, Hansberry's commitment to African people extended beyond academia, as he co-founded the Ethiopian Research Council in 1934 and the African American Institute in 1953. The full scope of his intellectual work has yet to be realized, and he trained a number of future leaders, including Nnamdi Ezekwe, the former president of Nigeria. In response to Crawford's expose on Hansberry, readers of Ebony Magazine wrote in from Detroit, Chicago, Brooklyn, and Durham, all praising the efforts to present a more complete history of Africa. Months after the publication, Lerone Bennett authored a regular piece about Negro history, which appeared in Ebony Magazine.
Building on the interest from Crawford's feature story, Ebony Magazine published a 5-part series entitled Africa's Golden Past, written by anthropologist and archaeologist William Leo Hansberry himself. The series was illustrated by Eugene Harper Johnson. Johnson was so inspired by the earlier Ebony article, The Scholar Nobody Knows, that he sought out Hansberry and eventually worked with him on the illustrations. As a child of Birmingham, Alabama, Eugene went on to work under the tutelage of the famed artistic brothers Beaufort and Joseph Delaney. He was eventually awarded an honorary doctorate for his contributions of using art to promote African history, and in the 1990s moved to Oman to paint a series of events in Omani history. While in Oman, he was granted Omani citizenship and made his transition to the capital city in 2016. The 5-part series he helped to illustrate was a teaser for Hansberry's book, Ageless Africa, A Pictorial History of the Golden Past, a book that we don't believe was ever published.
Another insightful piece comes from a 1971 article titled Two Blacks Discover Lost African World, which highlights the transcontinental relationships that existed between archaeologists and artists. The story discusses the excavations of Dr. James E. Lewis and Dr. Ekpo E. Ewo in Nigeria. Dr. James E. Lewis was a renowned sculptor, artist, and collector with his own works heavily influenced by contemporary and historic African art. Lewis was known in his own right for his role in establishing what is now the James E. Lewis Museum of Art in Maryland, which boasts over 3,000 works from Africa and the African diaspora at Morgan State University. Dr. Ekpo O. Eyo is a renowned archaeologist, anthropologist, and art historian. After receiving advanced training at Cambridge, the University of London, and a PhD from the University of Ibadan in Nigeria, he served as the Director of Antiquities for Nigeria for more than a decade, overseeing excavations throughout the country. And for those of you who are involved in African archaeology, He was also the former president of the Pan-African Archaeological Association from 1983 to 1995. While the director of antiquities in Nigeria, he invited Dr. Lewis to the country to participate in excavations at Owo. The project was considered the first of its kind to be sponsored by the Nigerian government to study the early history of the country. Dr. Lewis hoped that there would be findings that could be exhibited at historically black colleges and universities and inspire students to become more interested in African history and achievements. The article provided not only a platform for Lewis and Ayo to share their research, but also inform the public as to how archaeology was actually conducted. They described the processes of excavating, sifting, and sorting.
Finally, we want to spotlight a piece in the 1959 article, A Student's Journey into the Past, written by a young African-American woman who was an alum of Barnard College and student of the University of San Carlos. Awarded the Inter-American Cultural Convention grant, Dorothy, or Dottie, as she preferred to be called, recounts her experiences spending a year in Guatemala. Equipped with a degree in Spanish and an interest in Mayan history, she recounts her trips to the National Museum of Anthropology Tikal and excavations at Kumanal, Huyu. While Dorothy expressed her interest in continuing her education of modern languages, her story is telling of Black women getting trained in archaeology as early as the 1950s and expanding the discussion beyond African and African diasporic history.
In 2016, Ebony Magazine and its companion publication, Jet Magazine, were sold to Clearview Group, which later rebranded them as Ebony Media Corporation. In July of 2020, the publication declared bankruptcy and was sold to former NBA player and businessman Ulysses Jr. Bridgman for $14 million. Soon after declaring bankruptcy, many of the assets were sold at auction, while others were donated. The J. Paul Getty Trust, Ford Foundation, MacArthur Foundation, and Mellon Foundation purchased many of the photo archives, with additional archives being acquired by the Getty Research Institute and the National Museum of African American History and Culture. The journal continued in publication until 2019, and in March of 2021, it was rehabilitated as an online-only magazine. Other books and periodicals from the Johnson Publishing Company were donated to Chicago-based artist Theaster Gates and are on display at the Stony Arts Bank. The 1950s, and more importantly 1960s, under the leadership of Lerone Bennett, were seen as sort of the golden age of Black history and archaeology in Ebony Magazine. Ebony Magazine had done important work to educate the public about the writings of discoveries that paint Africa in a more positive light. It was especially important for Black people around the world because it was giving them access to information that often wasn't readily available in school curriculums. The magazine provided a space for archaeologists, historians, and artists from Africa and the African diaspora to share their research to a wider audience and tease portions of their monograph. The visuals and incorporations, artistic renderings, and short-form essays are actually some of the tactics that we've employed in the Society of Black Archaeologists in our annual newsletter. And this is an example from our latest newsletter where we spotlight Dr. Elisa Odewale, who is a professor at University of Tulsa. We took seriously this call from Lerone Bennett to make history dramatic, human, and readable, not to exaggerate, but to dramatize, and to attract a much wider audience. So these are some of the things we try to do in our own publication moving forward.
The variety of articles and features demonstrate an array of stories from students to professors from Africa, America, and the Caribbean. At a time when archaeological research pertaining to Africa was limited, Ebony provided an outlet and means of dissemination to educate a wider public about the latest discoveries and trends in African history. Additionally, the work of Dr. Ekpo Ayo of Nigeria speaks to the early works of African archaeologists independently leading excavations on the African continent. The fact that these transcontinental collaborations occurred in the 1970s gives renewed inspiration to the potential for more diasporic collaborations between historical Black colleges and universities in the US, and universities in Africa in future research. We regularly hear that Black people weren't interested in archaeology or that it was difficult to convince students, but the fact is you'd be surprised who expresses interest in the field. Case in point, a young Venus Williams.
Here's a question I'm sure you've been asked more than once.
Yes.
What do you want to be when you grow up?
Tennis player. I would like to be a tennis player.
Is there something else you want to be? What would it be?
A veterinarian. I think I'd be an archaeologist.
Really?
Yes.
What interests you about archaeology?
Mostly dinosaur bones, and then after that would be Indian civilization. Pretty unusual career.
So as you saw, in reality, what we are dealing with is not a lack of interest, but our own inability to supply a captive audience with the resources to sustain their attention.
The work presented here is just the beginning of a much larger project to tell the history of African and African diasporic archaeology, as well as the role that non-academic venues can play in engaging wider audiences in archaeological research. There is a need to look deeper into the names that are presented in the pages of Ebony Magazine. For those of you who are familiar with my own research, the image of Oliver Christian, for example, caught my attention. In the early pages of Ebony Magazine, he's listed as a maritime archaeologist at the College of the Virgin Islands in St. Thomas. And again, I work in what is now the US Virgin Islands as well. And aside from this short piece in Ebony Magazine, the only other information I've been able to find about Mr. Christian is an obituary from 2016 that lists his next of kin but makes no mention of his archaeological contributions. As part of the larger collection of the Johnson Publishing Company, Ebony Magazine was just one of several magazines that cater to the Black community. The Google Books repository has only digitized the magazines from 1958 to 2008, meaning that there are additional issues from 1945 to 1958, as well as from 2008 to the present that could offer more compelling articles about the field. Our next endeavor will be to comb through other related publications for similar stories, such as the older Negro Digest, which was later rebranded as Black World, and later as well, Jet Magazine. A preliminary search through Jet Magazine's archive reveals a compelling story about a young Alma McGee in December of 1974, and she is featured as the Beauty of the Week in Jet Magazine. McGee was described as a designer, model, and actress, as well as a student of archaeology at the University of California, Los Angeles. If we're going to expand the historiography of archaeology in terms of the people who are represented and the stories in which they tell, we're going to have to explore all of these diverse archives. Thank you all. We would again like to thank the Bunch Center for the fellowship to bring us together, as well as the Coates Institute for hosting this talk today.